Welcome to Business Unmuted, thanks to our sponsor Virtue Motors, one of the UK's largest motor retailers, representing some of the world's best manufacturers of cars, vans and motorcycles. Check out its website at virtuemotors.com. Well, today we're going to be having a really lively Business Unmuted with a lot of guests. I'm Graham Robb and I started Recognition PR nearly 35 years ago. We have 75 clients in lots of different sectors with turnover of approximately 6 billion. We employ around 30,000 staff, so we're at the front line of business and perfectly placed to discuss the economic climate. In the studio we have David Land. Now David is director of the business consultancy for manufacturers, Drive to Business, but he's also the founder of the Northeast STEM Foundation. We also have Marion Marsland, who's the chief operating officer of the Thermal Insulation Contractors Association, and down the line we have Stephen Massey, operations manager at Solehawk Ltd, which operates around 10 care homes in Newcastle and Gateshead area. Welcome everyone. First of all, let's just look at the issue of fuel, because yesterday the Competition and Markets Authority issued a report about fuel prices in Britain, saying it was the most volatile year for fuel pricing since reliable records began. And they talked about the rocket and feather effect, where pump prices surged 50 pence a litre, but actually the wholesale price fell quite a lot, and the wholesale price going up and then down again was not echoed by the fuel price at the pump, which went up but then gently went down. So rocket up and feather down. So the pump prices went up by 50 pence a litre from January to July, but fell by 31 pence a litre for petrol and 14 pence a litre for for diesel. But if you look at the wholesale price, the percentage fall was greater. Well, if we look at energy generally first, fuel is important, and that's an indicator, the oil price, but generally, how is your business coping? Marion, you're training lots of people at the Thermal Insulation Contractors Association. How is fuel for you in your workshops?
Fuel's a big issue for us. Obviously, we've got a huge workshop. It's a very difficult space to heat. But I guess as a business, we're in a really luxury position in that as a trade body, part of our job is to pilot schemes and show our members way forward. We're thermal insulation, we're about sustainability. So we're rapidly speeding up our programme of improving our own energy efficiency, drive to electric cars and away from the pump, move away from gas and move to renewable energy. Another £75,000 investment in solar panels, in addition to £80,000 investment last year. So I think we feel that there's not really going to be any way back from this. It may peak and fall, but it's really the trajectory is really only going one way.
Yeah, I suppose it is in gas and electricity. It feels that way, but there is now evidence from the Competition and Markets Authority. The oil price went up and it came down, but the gentle decline at the petrol pumps affects us all, and maybe something should be done.
But do you not think, Graham, that what it is, it's the first time for a lot of years where we've had the cap taken off? I come from an automotive background, and price down is there. Price up is a hard thing to negotiate. And what happened through the pandemic and into this year, all of a sudden that ceiling's gone off, so opportunists take in. So those prices go up unnecessarily sometimes, and you can understand why they're not coming down. Are they trying to put money back in their business so they can reinvest, or are they just capitalising on a short-term opportunity?
And in America they use the phrase gouging. That's the phrase, price gouging.
Yeah.
And if there's a hurricane, for instance, in Florida, and the petrol prices go up because of it, the retailers are accused of price gouging. But things can be done to stop it. Legislation is there to stop artificial increases in price. Now, we don't necessarily want a return to solid prices commission like there was in the 1970s, but is there around our group of guests any appetite for some kind of rules-based system on this?
I think there is, because especially when you drive down the high street, not the high street, but when you drive around and you pass the fuel stations, why can one sell their petrol at 146 and another one sells it at 159? There should be some levelling out on there. I think for everyone in the UK, they want to see some level of uniformity, that if it goes up, I get it, but if it comes down, I also wanted to see it come down in the same level. So I think there should be some rules. But I think everyone's accepting now that they'll never get back to where they were, and people are now starting to take more of their own initiative. What can they do to be self-sufficient? Solar panels. We've got a couple of manufacturing companies, smallish, but now investing in solar panels. One putting 700 panels on the top of their roof because they can become 20 or 30% efficient and not be dependent upon.
We'll come to Stephen in a minute, but Marion, you mentioned solar panels, what you're doing in your workshops to try and make them energy efficient. Is it actually paying off yet? Are you able to see it in the amount of energy consumed?
Absolutely, we can see it when we get the checks back. You know, some of our panels were in the very early stages with a trade-in. I have to say, we spent £20,000 this time with Northern Grid to improve the infrastructure so that we can actually generate the power back into the system, which was a bit of a blow. But just going back to your point, Graham, on legislation, it's interesting, isn't it, as business people and working in a capitalist environment, that we're talking about the implication of legislation because we're not happy with prices. I'm very wary of that.
And you're right, this is the programme to say that. Business Unmuted, and you're right. And I'm sort of being devil's advocate. I'm wary of it as well. Although at home, I have solar panels on my roof, and I noticed that the price of electricity has gone up, but feed-in tariff for me to sell the electricity hasn't.
Yeah.
So they work it on all ways. Let's go to Stephen. You run care homes, 10 care homes. My goodness, energy must be a really big headache for you.
Well, it is. You know, we actually have very little opportunity to control. Yes, we can walk around, turn lights off and things like that, but, you know, we have to heat them 24/7, and that's 365 days a year. We have to, lights are on, and, you know, the residents we have need the ability to do that. My frustration is now with all these price changes, the lack of flexibility to move around, to select, to choose. You know, you've got to try and tie yourself into something right now to try and keep the prices down, and it's very, very difficult to do that. We don't have that flexibility that we used to have.
Now,
it's a frustration for us all.
Did introduce the energy price cap for all businesses until April, and when it introduced that, it did say that there are certain types of businesses, and they mentioned nursery schools, they mentioned nursing homes, vulnerable businesses, where you're not operating at high margins, but the people who are using your buildings are vulnerable, by children, older people, and therefore they may look at that price cap being extended. Now, were you in a position where that would make a difference, or did you negotiate very good terms on your long-term tariffs?
We weren't in the position. We're not being actually involved in that. They're not being. Nobody's come to us and say, right, what do you need? What can we do to help? What effect does this have? I'm slightly different in so much that the other half of the business are hotels. So we've had some flexibility in securing deals because of the hotel part of the business. But from a care home perspective, like most of the announcements the governments have made, we don't get told, we don't get advised. They're not keeping us up to date, and when they do, it's usually after the event. So you know, it would be good to be involved. It would be good to say what can we do to help, and some sort of price fixing would absolutely help.
Okay, and what measures are you taking to save energy? I mean, you talk about turning lights off and so on, but have you installed other alternative forms, solar panels, or have you?
Yes, we are doing that. We are actively installing solar panels into a few of the homes in Newcastle and Gateshead. Some already had them, luckily, but we're actively doing that now because we think we've got no option. We have invested in the fleets for myself, and that we have electric cars, but that's for the guys that are on the road. But we are installing them wherever we can. But most of our buildings are old, and some don't lend themselves too easily to have these things fixed onto them and fit in the right sort of way. But we are doing that.
My own building, my office building, has a flat roof, so it's something I'm actively looking at the moment. But I said to you, I did solar panels at home, but I'm at work when the sun is out, so I don't use the electricity, bit daft, so I can program maybe the washing machine to go on when the solar's, but what I'm now doing is investing in batteries. And has anyone looked at battery technology?
Battery is key. It's still not there yet from a commercial. It's only on the outside edges for domestic use. It's certainly not there for commercial. But it's interesting that in terms of the building, we're talking about solar panels. Actually, the biggest expanse of energy is through the walls, and we don't have enough skilled people to retrofit. we're talking about our net zero policy for energy efficiency in buildings, what we need to understand is 80% of the buildings that need to be zero energy efficient by 2050 are already built.
Yeah, it is.
So it's how do we address the existing building stock? It's not about new buildings.
And sometimes the buildings are not old. We're sitting in our studio here in a building that was built in 2006. When I had it audited, the roof, the heat goes out through the roof because it isn't built to domestic standards. And I don't know if you obviously in your sector you must come across this all the time.
Well, we're the thermal insulation contractors, and I can tell you I work in the coldest building.
Right.
Because it's a building we've taken over. We had very little input into its build, but I would say it's a building that needs significant retrofitting if it's going to have any chance of achieving net zero. And actually the energy that we're producing from the panels is a fraction of what we really need to do.
Okay, and I'm sorry, David, you're going to give it to Stephen. I'm going to ask you about your buildings. You said there's a mixture in your portfolio, but of course you're a commercial business, and TICA looks after commercial businesses, doesn't it?
Well, our members will work on commercial buildings.
Is insulation something that you've actively looked at in your homes?
Yes, we have, and we have double glazing as you'd expect. We have done insulation. We are doing that. We are reviewing that. We've gone around changing the light bulbs over, for instance, over to LEDs and things like that. And when we have to replace things, we look at the most efficient systems that we can put in. And so we are doing that. But insulation does form part of any upgrades that we do.
All right. And David, your point on this?
Yeah, the point I was going to try and link what we talked about at the beginning. I think there's a lot of people that don't know really what to go by. What should I do to my building? It's hard to get independent advice because you've got a lot of people who are capitalising on this is in vogue, so I can charge what I want, and it's in short demand. I've just put solar panels on my home with batteries and inverters, and I could double the batteries up. So I'm now today was a nice day because I charged my battery up, but then I'll store it and I can use it overnight. Absolutely. Or I can use it the following day. And it's getting that advice, I think, that's important.
If you've got any takeaways from this programme, I was privileged to chair the Make UK Northern Conference last week, and there was an expert on battery technology, and the pricing of batteries is basically £1,000 a kilowatt. So if you've got a 5 kilowatt battery in your house, it should cost around £5,000. And if you've got a big battery, commercial battery, you could be talking about £1 million in a big steel container. So that's the kind of price at the moment. Let's see if that comes down. Let's change the subject now. It's been called the winter of discontent. There are a few people around this conversation who remember the real winter of discontent, but there's a slide we'll put on showing the number of strikes that there are throughout December. Now these are mostly public sector strikes, postal workers, there's some teachers, there's rail workers, ambulance staff, nurses taking action over December, quite disruptive. Now, this is a business programme, and I to give my opinion on this as someone in business. Watching the media and seeing this matter being discussed, there's a lot of attention to who's on strike and why, and the strikers get interviewed and the unions get interviewed, and then the effects on the public are discussed. But the management haven't really put their case very well at all in public. I mean, I couldn't really enunciate properly what the management case is for their offer to the rail workers. And I consider myself relatively well informed. I do know it's roughly 8% split over a couple of years with part of it backdated. Or I know that the nurses want 19% and the Prime Minister said that's unaffordable. But the case, the other side of the argument isn't being ventilated much, is it, David?
No, it's not at all. And I think for me, it's a little bit about choice. You know, you talk about running your business. You sit with your balance sheet, you see where your cash is, you make a decision what you invest in and what you don't. But I think at the minute, everyone expects everything. And whether it's the nurses, whether it's the rail workers, some of them are on pretty good wages, you know, and the fact that they're asking for more, I think, is unrealistic. If they were given a series of choices, what would you choose and which would you compromise on? But I fully agree, there is only one side of the conversation that's on the TV, not both.
And
it's been
there's
done
a lot of conversation about people's wages being eroded, or the real terms wage cut, or how they are lining up their wages against other people in the public sector, not necessarily in the private sector. It used to be called demarcation when it was in old industrial years. But it strikes me that there are a couple of things that occur that need to be mentioned maybe in public. The first is that some of these strikers, nurses particularly, who one has a lot of sympathy for the difficult job they do, but they do have a pay review body. And a pay review body they were introduced by the Thatcher government in 1980 for the police and the army, because the police and the army couldn't strike, and then they were extended to doctors and NHS staff, professional staff, and there was a sort of, not an official, but there was an understanding that you have a pay review body, you shouldn't strike, because there's people who work in our businesses don't have a pay review body. We pay them what we can afford, and that hasn't really been mentioned. What do you think, Stephen?
Well, the pay review body was mentioned in so much that they don't follow it. They don't trust them, because they've not been changed since they were first set up. So the guidance that they're working to isn't sufficient. My only thought is that they've got these bodies. These bodies should be making the right recommendations, and it depends on the data they look at and when they look at the data they look at. And I think that the pay review bodies are influenced by government. No matter what they say, they are influenced by government and what's going on locally. But they should. If they're sitting there, and every government so far has followed and followed the recommendations, and that's the way it should be. But the question around is the recommendations been right? Has it actually reflected what they've been said, what they looked at?
No.
But personally, I think that there is an argument for a lot of these, and certainly for the nurses to look at their pay. But that's on the public sector. What they've got to remember in my business is I've got nurses, I've got these care staff, and I'd love to give my staff a 90% pay rise, but I know it's unrealistic. And you're right, we've got to get the management argument, the counter argument to this.
At least
paying conditions for the NHS, for the public sectors, are by way far better than anything I can provide my staff.
And it would be impossible for you to give the holiday and the pension entitlement that you get out of an NHS pension.
Yeah. And that's why I lose staff to the NHS, because of the conditions, terms and conditions they get. So it's and that's a big thing for me at the moment. My staff are leaving to join the NHS because of terms and conditions.
And that's a very interesting point, because you see the arguments on the television and radio from nurses, and they're saying the nurses are leaving the NHS, but your evidence is that isn't the case. And it's not because, everyone around this table would want to say we like what the nurses do and respect the nurses. If we can just take that emotion out of it and look at how we can maintain the number of nurses' jobs.
Absolutely.
David,
we need them. We need them, and we are short of them.
David?
You would, but wouldn't you think in 2022, 2023 that we've got the capacity to sit round and resolve this in an amicable way?
Which brings me to ACAS. Do you remember ACAS?
I remember it, and I've used it.
You've used it, right? Tell me your experience of ACAS, because it seems to me ACAS, which we as taxpayers fund ACAS, remind our viewers what ACAS is. I had to explain it to some people in my office who were in their 30s.
The Arbitration and Conciliation Service, what it was when you were miles apart, if the expectation, we probably sat there with the nurses at 19% versus what might be affordable at 3 or 4%, whatever the two numbers are. You're miles apart. That's not negotiable range. And then there is a complete indifference, is that one side won't listen to the other. You get someone with industrial experience or experience in business, and they talk to either side independently and try and bridge a way through to get to a solution, which is where we should be.
And what is your experience of using ACAS, the service itself? Because it's free, as I understand it's free. Did you have a good experience of using ACAS?
We did. I only used it once for any real significance, but no, it was positive. It was an arbitrator, somebody that would just come and talk to both sides differently, and look, you're here, you're there, and you got the balance of opinion.
In the case of when you did use it, we don't need the detail of it, but were you able to come out with a resolution because of using ACAS?
We resolved, and we probably resolved inside a week and a half to 2 months.
You see, it strikes me. I'm a child of the 70s. I remember the Winter of Discontent, and this is not the Winter of Discontent. There's no secondary picketing. It's the private sector isn't affected because there's a realistic approach to the private sector. There's stuff in the shops. It isn't the Winter of Discontent, but in the 70s, one of the good things that the Callaghan government did was ACAS, and Jim Callaghan himself said you shouldn't strike while there are negotiations underway. And if people are at ACAS, he used to say, as a Labour Prime Minister, you mustn't strike while you're negotiating. Marion?
Well, I think you've got a perfect storm, haven't you? We're talking about negotiation process where it's just a simple dispute over pay. And whether that's public sector, the nurses, the railway workers, private sector, there are other things that are going on in the background that are fueling this, and actually, I see this akin to where we were a few years ago. This is linked to, in my own view, I think there's a broader political picture here where there is leverage of a group of workers. There is the perfect storm to utilise that leverage. It's not just simply a question of I've asked for 10% and you're offering me 2%. We're being fed all the issue of, this terminology and this narrative of the cost of living crisis. In my own sector, we've had unofficial industrial disputes on local TV with banners out there talking about the cost of living crisis, and many of these workers will be earning double, if not triple, what a nurse would be earning. So it's a much more complicated picture than we simply can't reach an agreement, because there are so many other things that are happening behind the scenes, and every industry's got slightly different baggage attached to it. I think.
All right, go on, David.
I was going to say, I think the point you made there is to reach an agreement. At the minute, when I watch CTV, I don't think there is as it was one side of that argument that wants, or even both, wants to reach an agreement. The rail unions are not taking things to their members. They're not allowing that vote to take place. There's a political bias in there.
All right. Well, let's just put this one last thing and we'll move on to another subject. The last thing, the Sunak government said today, in Prime Minister's questions, he's going to bring law to force here. The law that he's likely to bring to force was in the Conservative manifesto, which is minimum thresholds of service when you're on strike. I mean, I don't know what the minimum thresholds would be, but say for argument's sake, 20% the trains should run, or 50% the ambulances should be available, whatever the threshold is appropriate. Now, do you think that will A, be something the public will warm to, and B, it does have fairness and equity attached to it? Stephen first.
Well, I think actually it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I don't think it's the right option. I think to put legislation in place to deal with something like this actually works against what they're actually aiming to do. I don't think it's the right thing, and I think your comment earlier on about the private sector being more realistic, because it has to be. I think to do this, it will actually work exactly the opposite way that we want it to do, and I think legislation is too much.
Okay, David?
Interesting challenge. I think for me, I don't think you should have a percentage. I would be no strike. They shouldn't be allowed, full stop.
While they're negotiating.
While they're negotiating, but I think, go back to the point I made before, you've got to find a way of what is the difference, how do we resolve it? And if you bring ACAS back or in a different form, let's resolve the problem.
So you have a mechanism that justifies no strike. You don't say no strike, you don't withdraw people's right to strike.
Correct.
Marion?
I'm definitely in the middle. I was on the railways yesterday, my train was cancelled, but it was still mayhem. I think that taking away people's right to action almost incites them more. I think they're somewhere in the middle, and I think if the percentage of, there has to be a percentage coverage. If it's a proportionate percentage, then I think the public could be brought in favour of that. And certainly with trains and rail strikes, if you're one of those unfortunate people that desperately need to train on Christmas Eve to come back and see your mum, you would really welcome a minimum service.
Well, my daughter's one of those, coming back to see her dad. She's flying in from America the day before, and we need to get her up to, we'll rent her a car in the end.
May I just add something there? Because
yes, of course.
Being an ex-military man, which I am, my frustration in all of this is this constant referring, going back to get the military in to run this and the military to run that. And the vast majority of these military personnel going in there to do it get paid less than the people that are actually striking.
That's a very good point, Stephen.
The people there, and it's a real frustration that people that are in critical industries are striking, and it's all right saying they're going on strike, but there'll be enough ambulances for this and enough for that. They are critical industries to us, and I agree that actually that there are times when strike is not the right thing to do.
I do get a sense that from this group here, the opinion has slightly changed. I noticed some polling on the rail strike. When the Christmas Eve rail strike was announced, suddenly it went to 51% against where the strikers were. So I think there's a bit of a moving feast here. The last question to you all. The government, a Conservative government that labelled itself pro-business, and I know everyone who watches this knows that I was supportive of that government and helped Rishi's campaign, but on Monday they announced a statutory right to request flexible working. Now, let's not overheat it, because it doesn't mean you have to give flexible working, but the statute will be that any worker from day one that they work from you is allowed to request flexible working, which doesn't just involve working from home. It could be how their holidays are arranged, working hours, childcare, so on. Now, it sounds nice and it sounds very cuddly, but I'm going to look to you first, Stephen. You're running a nursing home group. I should imagine rostering staff is one of the headaches of management.
It absolutely is, and we are legally obliged to have a certain number of staff on duty at any one time, and quite rightly so. So there are certain roles where flexible working just cannot happen, and as much as we want it to do, it just cannot happen. Yes, we can be flexible on the days they work, and we can be flexible on how they book their holidays, but it has to be realistic about what the expectation of flexible working is. When a staff member hears about flexible working, they automatically think they can ask for what they want and they'll get it. We did an example some time ago about school kids. Most of my staff have children, so they'd like to take them to school and I like to pick them up. But that means that we've got to have people that start before that and there are people after that. So flexible working isn't the answer.
I know the minister responsible is a plain-speaking Yorkshireman, Kevin Hollingrake, and he went in the paper and said it's a no-brainer. Well, it didn't sound to me that it was a no-brainer, David.
I think there's two sides of it for me. From a manufacturing point of view, you can't do it. Everyone is demanding their product. If they click on their iPad tonight, they want it delivering tomorrow morning. Yes. That means people have to be at work 24/7. So it doesn't work from a manufacturing industry. I came from automotive, and you were timetabled to a 20-minute slot of when your product was either collected or you delivered. So it's regimented. You can't have flexibility. And if you've got an organisation where you've got people who can't be flexible and then another series that are, it's difficult to balance. But the compromise that I think we've got in there is, I chair the UTC, which is slightly different. It works a longer...
University Technical College.
University Technical College, yeah. It works a slightly longer day, 31 hours rather than 25. And we've got parents who can drop their children off...
A longer week, not a longer day.
Sorry, did I say a day? Yeah, a week.
I think that's pretty good productivity. Yeah. I think we'll all applaud that. A 31-hour day. Well done.
Yeah, let's vote for that. So I think, it's good that they've got that. People can drop them off and work. So that flexibility can work, but I think one size doesn't fit all. It can't be one or the other, but it's hard. How do you make the compromise when part of your workforce can't be flexible and other ones can? It's a hard balance to make. It's got to be, can't be just you have to have it. It's got to be something that's either got to be negotiated, earned, or worked for.
All right, Marion, you get last word.
Well, first of all, it's changed in that when you can request it, but it's not changed from the employer in that you have to give it. And the second thing I would say is we're all sat here today and we've all got chronic staff shortages and we're dealing with Generation Z.
Yeah.
Grandparents put the roof over your head, parents gave you a standard of living, and young people today want choice. Yeah. And if we're going to give competitive advantage within our businesses and we turn our back on flexible working, don't be surprised when it's even harder to compete in an employment market.
Marion, measured answer. Thank you very much. That's it. Next week is the last Business Unmuted of 2022. We're going to have a few weeks off for Christmas. Do join us then. Thank you very much.